lot of us fall into the trap of thinking that if you're experiencing pain or sadness or grief, that there's some sort of deficiency. You don't control whether you experience grief or pain, but you can control your response to it. Grief is like a wound that never fully heals. It's always there. Tawakkul is the way to get through trials.
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Welcome back to the 6 Degrees podcast. Today my heart is elated, and inshallah by the end of this episode viewers will know why. We're joined by our beloved brother Ameen Soliman.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair, Brother Ameen, for coming on the podcast. So just to give the audience a little bit of an introduction about him, Ameen is a community servant with a background in business operations and program management. He currently works as an executive assistant at the Islamic Council of Victoria and serves as the president of Basira Forum, which is an Islamic Q&A initiative. He's also the former president of the University of Melbourne Islamic Society, UMIS. So we have two UMIS alumni, or President alumni is here with us today, and Ameen is very passionate about empowering Muslim youth and supporting the wider community. So we're very, very glad and very excited to have Ameen on the episode today. He'll be talking about, and our main topic for today will be about grief and loss, and we're really interested and excited to get into it.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Walaikum salam.
We would like to acknowledge the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on where we are located today. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people present with us today. We would also like to acknowledge the ongoing genocide and war going on in Palestine, as well as other oppressed countries such as Sudan and Congo.
And just for our viewers as well, inshallah, maybe we'll start off with a little bit about your childhood.
So I was born and raised in Melbourne. My father was Egyptian. He came to Australia with his parents when he was 8 years old. My mother is of a Syrian background. She was born in Germany. She came here with her family when she was 2 years old. So my parents essentially spent most of their life here. I was the eldest of 3 children. We all grew up in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And we all went to Islamic schools and then went to university after that. Also in the house, we had my paternal grandmother who I built a very strong relationship with, and she lived with us until she passed away.
Beautiful.
What was your relationship like with your grandmother? You said that she lived with you your whole life. Not many people would have experienced that, especially in the West. Were you guys very close?
Yeah, I had a very special bond with my grandmother. I think, as you said, it's not very typical, the relationship that I had with her. And what added to that was the fact that, so as I mentioned, my dad and his parents came to Australia when he was 8 years old. And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, ended up passing away when my father was 16. And my grandmother was a widow at 42, so that's quite young. And my father being the only child, so it was basically just my grandmother and my father here in Melbourne. I think, I don't know too many details, but I think there were certain periods where like maybe extended family came from Egypt to support for a bit of time, but for the most part, it was just those two fending for themselves. So given, I guess, all that background and the fact that my dad was her only child, and I was her first grandchild, the first child of that only child, I think we naturally just had a very strong bond, and she was with us until I was about 14 years old.
Wow, subhanAllah. And so at 14 years old, she passed away. What was that like for you?
It was very difficult. It was my first time experiencing grief firsthand. I saw other people experience grief when I was younger. For example, I had extended relatives that passed away when I was like 4 or 5 years old, but I was too young to kind of process it or for it to have much meaning for me. So that was my first real loss. The situation around her like passing was she used to every few years try to go back home to Egypt. All her family was there, her siblings, her nephews and nieces, etc. When she was in Egypt one time in 2011, when I was 13 years old, she called home. She used to stay for a few months. She called home and she actually wanted to cut the trip short and come back home because she was feeling like she felt something was wrong. She came back to Australia, went to the hospital, got some tests done, and we actually found out unexpectedly, like there were no signs leading up to this, that she had like cancer that was quite developed. I don't remember what stage it was. I was young then. But she was given only 2 weeks to live. She ended up lasting 7 months. But yeah, that was my experience, my first experience with grief, where she was diagnosed with cancer. 7 months later, she passed away when I was 14 years old. And that was a very difficult experience, being my first time.
I'm also thinking about your dad, like, you know, you described such a close relationship between him and his mother, of course, them being alone together, kind of in the big wide world. I can't imagine how hard that would have been for him and for you to witness him go through that grief as well.
SubhanAllah, yeah. My father, if he was going through a lot of grief, he didn't show much of it. I only literally saw him shed a single tear on the day that she passed, and I never saw any, like, any outward sense of grief from him beyond that. Even though I knew that, you know, he had a very strong relationship with her, but his iman was, you know, he had very strong iman. He was I probably haven't seen many or any people personally that had Iman like my father, and I think that was through some of the trials he went through, mainly to do with like his father, and then some of the trials he had working in the community. But yeah, he was like a strong pillar for us. I think we took strength from his strength.
SubhanAllah.
He sounds like a very strong man, mashallah.
MashaAllah. And you know, there's nothing in the world like the kindness and the warmth of Egyptian grandmas. I can attest to that. What are some of your favorite moments with her that you can recall?
Specific moments, it's hard to like dial in on a specific moment, but just the general, the warmth, the balance between like I don't know, there's something like I said about Egyptian grandmothers where they're so warm, but they can also be like
Very
strict and
scary.
it holds you to account as well.
Yeah.
I just remember, like, if I had to summarize my relationship with her, so eldest children, whether true or not, they always feel like, or they often feel like, mum and dad are always against me, this, that, like this too strict on me, whatever. So in my household, I always had this figment of my imagination. I don't know whether it was true or not, but I felt when I was younger that my sister was like daddy's girl, my brother was like mummy's boy, and I was like nana's boy or whatever.
Yeah.
So I had a very strong relationship with her, and she was like my confidant as well. Like I would vent her as, you know, the troubles of a 13-year-old or
Yeah, of course.
10-year-old, 8-year-old, you know.
Yeah.
And do you remember much of how you kind of internalized or processed that loss at 14 years old?
And we can go into the very early stages from finding out to, you know, seeing her condition deteriorate as well.
So, yeah, finding out was a shock to the system. Like I said, she was very healthy for her age. She was very strong. There were no such signs that she may or may not have cancer until she had those symptoms in Egypt, came back home and found out the results. So that was like a shock to the system. I actually remember the day where I was at school and my mum, like the office lady, called me out of the classroom, and then my mum took me home, and my mum told me like in the school car park or whatever, and yeah, it was very, very difficult. It was. I think we drove straight to the hospital to visit her. In terms of processing, I feel like from a young age, I did have the concept and framework of tawakkul and trust in Allah. And it was mainly learned from, I'd say, my grandmother and my father. of the people close to me, I'd say they had some of the greatest trials of people that I knew closely, and it also coincided with strong iman in both of them. So I kind of put two and two together and thought to myself, and I guess internalized that tawakkul is the way to get through trials. As things progressed, it was very, very difficult seeing her, go into the hospital for extended stays, have treatments, just be a shell of herself to the extent of eventually not being able to eat or drink. But yeah, it's hard to think back to specifics. It was over 10 years ago, but just I think I always had a sense of tawakkul, and I think seeing my dad standing strong, being very strong throughout, I think kind of rubbed off as well.
Yeah.
In terms of actually getting to the moment where just before she passed and then when she passed, I can remember that a bit better. There was, by that stage, as I saw her continue to deteriorate, there was a level of acceptance that I had that perhaps like these are, her last days upcoming. And by the time that she passed away, I had accepted Allah's will and decree. That does not mean that there was not pain involved, and there's not and feeling pain and having tawakkul are not mutually exclusive. You can have both. So that didn't diminish the pain at all. But I think in a way maybe it helped me manage it. Helped me stay hopeful that she's out of suffering, that she, inshallah she'll be in a better place, etc. So it gave me a sense of hope.
I find it quite profound that you talk about having tawakkul, but also still feeling that pain and that not being mutually exclusive. I would love for you to expand on that if you could, because you're so right. And I think that's a lot of the times what we get wrong in terms of healing, especially through an Islamic lens. We think that, we should just shove the pain away and lock it up in a box, because that pain means that we're not, reliant on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I would love for you to explain more about what that means to you.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that a lot of us fall into the trap of thinking that if you're experiencing pain or sadness or grief, that there's some sort of deficiency, which is not true at all. The strength comes from experiencing the pain and being able to still move forward with life and persevere. If you didn't experience pain or any negative emotions or feelings, then how can you be considered strong? Strength is, persevering despite those difficulties. So, yeah, I like I said, strength and tawakkul, as well as experiencing pain and sadness and grief, not mutually exclusive at all. And I think this wasn't a hadith that I knew at the time, but it's something that I knew learned about a few years later, and it definitely helped me with my father's passing, was the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and the last moments of his baby son, Ibrahim, where that hadith contains the answer within itself and shows that it's not mutually exclusive. Paraphrasing the hadith was, the son of the Prophet ﷺ, Ibrahim, had just passed. He was a toddler. He'd taken his last breaths, and I think the Prophet ﷺ was, I think the scenario was he was holding his son about to put him in the grave, and he said that the eyes shed tears. The heart is deeply grieved or deeply saddened, but that does not stop us from saying things that are pleasing to Allah or acting in a way that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I forget the exact phrasing, but that shows us that grief and pain is an opportunity. Like you can't deal with you don't control whether you experience grief or pain, but you can control your response to it.
Absolutely.
So the Prophet ﷺ showed that there's a way to please Allah, there's a way to act despite your grief, despite your pain. And I think that hadith, like, you don't need anything more than that to summarize that there's clearly no, like, they don't contradict each other, tawakkul and...
No, absolutely. I think in a similar vein as well, something that really resonated with me from your story is the challenges. You attributed your family's iman to the challenges that they went through. And I think there's a beauty there that might be sort of missing from some of our discussions in the modern day, where I think a lot of people's conditions or emotional states, or maybe, the way that they are, that they're not comfortable with, or any of those things that are associated with the things that they have gone through, forgetting that there is also the potential for, very difficult experiences to have a sweetness to them, in that they bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you can come to know the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, such as mercy, and the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are related to love through those experiences. And it's, I think, really forgotten in our current time, and as well with managing emotions. Like, we associate a lot of negativity with emotions such as sadness or anxiety, but emotions are just emotions, and they're avenues for us to explore our iman and Islam further, rather than sort of suppress or mitigate. And I think perhaps that's why a lot of people might see them as mutually exclusive, because that emotion is seen as bad.
Yeah.
But it's a way of knowing and understanding, oneself and the realities of the world as well.
Yeah, I think the hadith that you reference is one of my favorite hadith as well, in the sense that, I think it kind of establishes multiple things. One, beautifully kind of exemplifies how you said that this pain and this tawakkul, they're not mutually exclusive, like the Prophet ﷺ had so much pain, right? And in the same breath that he expresses his pain, he expresses his love and desire to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, subhanAllah, I think that's one of the most profound things that I take away from the hadith. But also, I think a lot of the times when we gather in our communities, there's this emphasis on, don't cry, like, don't be sad. Like, we push these emotions down in a way and, like I said, lock them into a box. But here you are in this hadith, literally being described with the Prophet ﷺ carrying his son in his arms and crying. Like, even the act of him crying and sitting there and, expressing that emotion, to me, that gives me so much, like, it fills me with so much sense of appreciation for him. The fact that he is able to exemplify, even within his pain and his grief, exactly what response and how we should, it's kind of like he's exemplifying the adab of almost grief and grieving and how to do that. So those are kind of, and I really appreciate you bringing up the hadith, because, I think there's a lot we can learn from it. Yeah.
And just to add to that, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ experienced pain and grief and sadness, experienced emotions that we all do as humans, that's what makes him the best of examples, because he experienced a lot of the things that we do, and in some cases to greater degrees. You can't say anyone experienced more grief than him when you look at how many people he lost and the difficulties that he faced. But he shows you how to act, how to respond. Like I said, you're not necessarily in control of what happens to you or events that happen to you, but you do have control over how you respond to it, and whether you turn it into something that brings you close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or something that distances you from him, regardless of the scenario.
SubhanAllah. And that's the beauty of the seerah as well. Like, anyone and everyone can resonate with it, whether you're here in, where are we, Truganina, or in the middle of Gaza. SubhanAllah, the Prophet's teachings and life is timeless.
Yeah, SubhanAllah. And I know that, perhaps your paternal grandmother passing away was the first loss that you experienced, but I know that there have been other losses in your life. I would love for you to speak a little bit more about that, if you could, Brother Ameen.
Yeah, so there are two other losses that have taken place in my life since then. The first one was my maternal grandmother, who passed away in 2021. I wasn't as close to her as I was with my paternal grandmother, but there was still difficulty in that. I got close to her as I got older. Her passing was somewhat unexpected. Like, she out of nowhere caught some lung infection or something, and and deteriorated pretty quickly and passed away. That was the first one, and the other one was a year and a half, maybe less than a year and a half later, maybe 15 months later in 2022, when I was 24 years old, the passing of my father, and that was like preceded by about 10 plus years of significant health scares almost every single year, sometimes multiple. So for context, my father, from as long as I remember, so like from childhood, when you get more mature and you start having memories and stuff, he did have his own battles with illness and sickness, but it really picked up after, like in the last 10 years of his life, so like 2012 onwards. And like I said, every year except maybe one, or maybe every single year, he had at least one significant health scare. And in the last few years, it only increased in frequency and severity. And then it culminated in his passing in 2022 when I was 24 years old. So that was like, that was like 10 years of continuous trials straight after my grandmother passed away, and then culminated in my father's passing a few years ago.
Brother Ameen, as you describe, I guess, this experience of losing your maternal grandmother and then eventually losing your father in 2022, I know that grief looks different to a lot of different people, and also we process it in different ways. I think there's also a sense of grief with experiencing our loved ones going through health scares, like the ones that you're talking about now, and also looking at, your family trying to process and go through all of that too. I'm wondering, over those 10 years, would you describe what you felt as grief as you watched your father go through those health scares, or is it something different?
I would say there was grief. Maybe it differs slightly to the grief when there's like a loss. But I think there's actually a term for it. I think it's called anticipatory grief.
Yeah.
So like you're experiencing grief, but you haven't actually had a loss. But the reason why you're experiencing grief is because you're anticipating a potential loss or a significant change in life, due to like someone close to you perhaps deteriorating or eventually passing. So I think there was definitely some of that, especially in the last few years when I really saw it take a toll on my father, like really kind of wearing his health down, his body down. I think there was definitely some of that. But I think it also prepares you for what's to come. So by the time that my father did pass, I was already in a mode of acceptance. I had surrendered to what Allah had willed, and I knew beforehand that it very well was a possibility that something might happen. I would experience that as grief, and in some ways it can be more emotionally exhausting than the actual loss.
Yeah.
And I think it differs from person to person, and that's also an important note, that people grieve in different ways in different timelines and things. But the reason why I say in some cases it can even be more emotionally exhausting is because when there's like a definite conclusion to something, so like a passing of someone, it's very, very painful, but at least there's a sense of closure. It's, in some ways, it's easier to have tawakkul. It's easier to accept what has happened because you can't do anything about it. But when there's a level of uncertainty, like you see, you have someone who's sick and going through difficulties, and there's nothing you can do about it. You really want to do something about it. You try and exhaust every option. You make dua that there's relief and cure, etc. But it's harder to surrender to the uncertainty that whatever you will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I accept and I'm willing to accept, as opposed to, like I said, with death, very painful, but there's a level of closure that makes it easier to accept. And I think it's hard to explain unless someone's experienced it.
Yeah, no, I completely understand what you're trying to say. I guess and you mentioned this earlier, it's exhausting kind of year in, year out, I guess preparing yourself for something and then, that, some kind of closure, not being there as well and kind of trying to hold on to that rope of hope, sometimes
hope
is the
for
hardest
sure.
part. And it's interesting because you said that you were able to see the wisdom, in his passing and his eventual passing.
The long period of anticipatory grief, that challenge of having hope and then having that hope taken away and going back and forth. You mentioned it was a lot more difficult than, the closure that comes with knowing that something has come to an end. How do you even begin to process something like that? How do you even begin to deal with something like that emotionally, especially over a period of 10 years where, these are the most fundamental years of your development and forming your character?
I think there's a few things that help me, process it and cope. One of the key ones was to see how my father, Allah yarhamullah, handled it with patience and things. He was the one going through the sicknesses and the difficulties, etc. And he always had firm trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he also had firm trust that if he did pass, that Allah will take care of us and stuff. So that was a level of reassurance there for me. Another way I tried to process it or deal with it was from a frame of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because I feel like, let's just say you had a pair of glasses, right? And the lenses were blue. How would you see the world if you put on those glasses? Blue. Everything will be blue. If you had red lenses, you would see everything red. So the lenses that you choose to view the world with have a profound impact on your experience and how you view things and how you deal with things. So I tried to have a lens of tawakkul and gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and knowing that He's more merciful to His slave than a mother to her child, things of that nature, that He is al-Latif, etc. So I tried to really build that into my thinking and understand that no matter what happens, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control and He is there for me. He will aid me, He will assist me. That doesn't necessarily take away from pain, but the reason why I brought up gratitude is there was one specific kind of thing I used to remind myself of, especially as I got later high school and into uni. Well, and I even had a conversation with a brother we know. I can tell you who it was later, but essentially I used to compare myself to my dad in the sense that I knew that he only had his dad for 16 years, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took care of him. I knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took care of him. So I looked at it that as if I've had my dad for 16 years. Any year beyond that is a blessing and a bonus, and that I'm grateful for it. So I think having that frame from late teen years did help me a lot, and helped me surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it's actually instead of looking at it as a calamity, I actually looked at it as a blessing. I got 16 years and now I'm getting more, so yeah.
I feel like I just gained a bit of a strategy as to how to look at things, from a tawakkul or a positive mindset, because I've never heard of seeing my blessings like that, but the way you presented it to me, it makes so much sense, right? I can see why that would have helped you and that would have guided you through those difficult times, because like you said, something that could have been perceived very negatively, and for what it is, alhamdulillah, it is a difficult thing to go through. The way you kind of perceive that as a blessing, I think not only would have allowed you to be more present with your father and, you know, your family and the things going on, but also allowed you to cope with some of those feelings. So subhanAllah, like Jazakallah khair for sharing that, because I feel like I took a lot away from that myself. Yeah.
I mean, how were the final days of your father's life like for you emotionally? Were you aware that those were the final sort of days, or did it come somewhat unexpected?
So my father spent the last month of his life in hospital. He wasn't in the best condition, but he was quite stable. And even from the doctors for the first 2 weeks that he was in there, maybe even more, they were saying that like, "Oh, we'll get you home in a week. Yeah, like nothing to be too concerned about. Things are stable. We just need to deal with some things and we'll get you home." But then he started to deteriorate slowly and then significantly the last few days. And that was where that was one of the toughest moments for me, because part of, I guess, my youth or my dealing with the sicknesses of my dad, I saw him have sicknesses and always like kind of bounce back to an extent, always be good. And I thought this would be another instance of that. So I really had to battle between like surrendering to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like I was constantly making du'as for Allah to provide my father with healing, to provide him with relief, long life, good health. And I was really like, I felt like I was really wrestling with what was happening and really trying to like force him, for like a better term, to like get healthy with my du'as and things. But it got to a point about 2 days before where I just surrendered to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My du'a changed from just focusing on giving relief, but asking for relief, but also acknowledging and accepting that Allah knows what's best, and I surrender to whatever you will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then I think that's when you talk about like the 5 stages of grief, that I don't know in too much depth, but I know generally. I think I got to the stage of acceptance probably 2 days before, like deep acceptance. I always had levels of acceptance, but deep acceptance like 2 days before my dad passed. And by the time he passed, I was in a frame where I was, you know, at peace. I was in pain, but I was at peace, alhamdulillah.
I'm wondering, you describe a loss when you were 14, you describe a loss in 2021 and then 2022. Were there any differences in the way that you processed and kind of managed each of them?
I would say that, you know, the ones when I was older, I had, I guess, more tools or to be able to deal with grief. It wasn't my first time, and I had I think a close relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I had better understanding. I experienced that, like, it's one thing to theoretically like have tawakkul, but then actually it's another level when you experience it, and you've gone through something difficult, and you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has always been there for you, and even in the difficulties He's given you certain ease, and you can see His subtleness and His gentleness. So yeah, I think in terms of processing it, I had more tools to process it in terms of a stronger relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tawakkul. And I think probably one of the main differences, if not the main difference, was obviously with my grandmother's passing, my father was like the pillar. With my dad's passing, I was like the pillar as the eldest child. So that was different, but I feel like because it was like 10 straight years, I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala slowly built me up to where I felt comfortable and capable.
Wow.
Taking on that responsibility.
Yeah, you mentioned being the eldest child and taking on that responsibility. What was going through your mind? How did you prepare?
Did you feel like you had to hold everything together?
I felt like it was my responsibility to, you know, be there for the family and kind of keep everyone together and look after them emotionally and be there for them. But I didn't necessarily look at it as like a negative thing. It was something that I expected and that I felt like I was ready for, and I knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be there to support me. So yeah, like as the eldest, maybe I had to process my grief slightly differently. But I don't necessarily think I had to put things aside for like I don't think I had to necessarily put things aside.
Yeah, and like you said, like in some ways you had kind of prepared over those 10 years to eventually take on some of that responsibility within itself. So, you know, in some ways you were, like we said, like prepared to do that. Were there any specific emotions you remember experiencing specifically after the passing of your father?
There was grief and there was sadness, of course, but there was also a sense of peace. Or I don't know if happiness is the right word, but like knowing that he's out of suffering. It was a difficult, life and portion of his life. And I think, you could say happiness with, I think like knowing that he did sacrifice a lot for the community, like a lot of community acknowledged that. So it gave me a sense of peace and hope that, the suffering for him is now done, and what's to come for him is good, inshallah.
Yeah. Inshallah. I think for me personally, every time I come in contact with grief, whether it's, in the hospital, you see someone on their final days or go to a janazah or something, I tend to think of my own mortality, and my life trajectory usually changes a little bit or even drastically in any of those moments. And I think with your experiences as well, having or coming in contact with grief often, did you ever pause and think to yourself, this is a point where I might change my life direction? And did you reflect deeply and often about your own mortality as well?
So, going through those experiences definitely made me think about my mortality a lot more often. It really made me think about how am I using my time, made me want to use my time for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it really kind of created a criteria for me that through which I assess different opportunities or ideas through that lens. So there may be things where, like, I might have been invited to certain things when I was younger that I would have engaged in, like things which are halal, but like what's referred to in the Quran as like play, like this world is full of play. That may not be the most beneficial thing that I might pass on now, or I may not engage in as much now. So I think that's one key. And the other thing is, it really made me always come back to intention. Really trying to purify my intention and remind myself of why I'm doing things. Thirdly, it made me have less attachment to the dunya and worldly things, because when you see people close to you pass away, you're reminded of your own mortality. So you know that your day will come, and this life is short, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, even 50 years or 100 years. There will be a time that comes. So I don't put as much weight on certain things as I may have in the past.
No, for sure. I think being reminded of our own mortality and how temporary life is sort of takes away from the appeal of so much of the dunya. It makes it so much easier to detach. Even things like personal grievances with other people and whatnot tend to kind of go down a little bit. But I think in terms of examples, a few have come to mind, but your dedication to the community, Allah Mubarak, is widely known and very much celebrated by so many people. Would you attribute some of that to those experiences, and are there any other examples that you can reflect on?
Absolutely, coming face to face with mortality does definitely have an impact on how I approach community work. But one thing I want to mention that you reminded me of in your question is one other thing that coming face to face with mortality does to you is it's very sad to see a lot of people out there, like there's brothers that may not speak to each other for years or may hate each other for years just because of a simple disagreement that could be resolved over one conversation.
Or
If
even
they were
family.
willing, if they were willing to just drop their pride. You see people who, yes, they may have been wronged. They might have every right to feel hurt, but them, because of pride, holding on to grudges that ultimately harm themselves more than anyone.
Absolutely, yeah.
So coming face to face with mortality, it really makes you think about what's important and what's not important, and dropping a lot of the petty stuff.
You've sort of developed a relationship where the ability to forgive has become, or let me reword that. You've developed a relationship with forgiveness where it's become something that has become ingrained within you, and you find it very easy to forgive people.
Generally, yeah, I'd say. And forgiveness, but also overlooking, trying to overlook things that other people may not overlook. And yeah, definitely trying to not hold grudges, because like I said, grudges, they destroy the person holding the grudge more than they destroy anyone else or harm anyone else. Back to your question about how it has influenced my community work, I think it definitely has, because coming back to that filter or criterion I talked about, where face to face with mortality, it makes you think about your purpose in life and prioritize what is most important, and maybe drop things which are, they could be halal, but they're not as beneficial. I feel like in my case, with my abilities, with the circumstances that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put me in, I think khidmah is one of those higher priority and one of the best things that I can engage in, to try and be of benefit to people, benefit to humanity. And
Khidmah is like community service, right?
Service.
Okay.
So, yeah, in that sense, I've always had like a inclination to khidmah, but I think going through grief and facing mortality, it's strengthened that desire further.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you and keep you steadfast always. You know, working in the community is not always an easy job. It's often a thankless job. And, alhamdulillah that you're such a pillar in our community that people, everywhere recognize that. I think that's a great achievement.
Now, we've spoken about, I guess, how you experienced and came to terms with the grief immediately after your father's and your grandmother's passing. But I think, it would be unwise to say that grief, ever leaves you, right? I know that for a lot of people who experience loss in many different ways, grief is something that follows them, throughout the rest of their life. What is your relationship with grief like, Brother Ameen?
So grief is like a wound that never fully heals. It's always there. Sometimes it's bleeds more intensely than others. Sometimes it doesn't bleed at all. Sometimes you don't know what might cause it to start bleeding. It could be something completely unexpected. I also think that grief is, it's always going to be with you, like I said, and it pops up at times you may not expect. Like, for example, one of my dad's friends was telling me shortly after my dad passed away that, he was like telling me that there's always grief and it can be triggered by random things. Like he was telling me, so my dad's friend, he grew up in like the 50s, 60s, and he was telling me that the other day he just saw like a house that had like skirting boards from the 1950s style, and that made him start crying. Like it just random things like that can trigger it. It could be like a food or like something that triggers a memory, like a place. So I think it's always there. And I think it's important for people to understand that there's nothing wrong with experiencing or feeling the grief long after the event has happened to you, whether it's a passing or something else. And I think one of the clearest examples of that is, once again, in the best example for us, the Prophet ﷺ, is he lost his mother when he was 6 years old. We also know there's a narration where he was traveling with his companions and he stopped by to visit his mother's grave. This was when he was in his 50s. And he was, sobbing quite heavily, even in his 50s, 50 years later. So, grief, you carry it with you for the rest of your life. So I think, there's a lot of people who feel a sense of guilt that why am I still grieving, or why do I still feel grief? I think it's important to know that it's always there, but it's also empowering to know that grief is there because you anticipate it, you're better prepared to deal with it, and you don't feel like that sense of guilt that all these years later, why am I still being triggered by something, or why am I grieving?
It's not really. I think some people may have viewed the time it takes to grieve as a form of weakness, but it's not something that you go through an allocated period of time, and if you go through it in a shorter period of time, you're stronger than someone. Grief is not something that ever goes away. It's not something that you ever sort of deal with, and then you can sort of assert your strength or show your strength through that way.
I think one other good way to look at it is you move forward with grief. You don't move on from grief. Moving on implies you leave it behind, that it disappears, but no, it's something that's always there, but you learn to carry it, you learn to move forward, and you gain the strength to be able to move forward with it. And one other thing that I'd like to touch on in terms of relationship with grief is that, and it comes back to the lens through which you experience the world, that you look at the world, is in some ways grief can be a blessing for a person for multiple reasons. It can remind you of your own mortality. It can remind you of your loved ones, where if you didn't have that grief, you may not remember them or think about them much. And the grief it pushes you to try and, in remembering your deceased loved one, it gives you that push to try and maybe make a dua for them, or give sadaqah on their behalf, or maybe maintain ties with those that they love and that they used to maintain ties with. So it's almost like a reminder from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remember your loved ones and to do good for them and good by them.
Yeah, that's true.
That's so beautiful. The beautiful thing about, I really like what you mentioned. It's really beautiful when you remember someone and you make dua for them. Remembering them and that grief being still there, it softens the heart. It brings emotion to your dua and it increases sincerity in it. But you also mentioned something else, which was maintaining close ties with the people that knew the person that you loved or that passed away. Have you found comfort in connecting with the people that would have known your father? Because I feel like a lot of people do kind of know more about the people that they loved from other people that may have loved them, and find a lot of comfort in remembering that person together.
Absolutely. Like I was referring to earlier about, it's one thing theoretically to have tawakkul, but then when you actually experience a situation where you have to have tawakkul, it brings a whole different meaning to it. I feel the same with the prophetic wisdom from the Prophet ﷺ encouraging children that one of the best ways to honor your deceased parents is to maintain ties with those that they maintain ties with or those that they loved. So I definitely experienced comfort in doing so, and I feel like I experienced or understood a level of wisdom in that teaching that I did not before experiencing it. And I really encourage those who are going through grief to maintain ties with the loved ones of their deceased loved one, is for multiple reasons. The one reason is you feel like by honoring those who in my case, who my father loved, or staying connected with them, it's like me, it's directing maybe the honor that I would have given to my father, or the respect or the obedience that I would have given to my father, or the servitude to those who he loved, which would make him pleased with me as his son. It also helps with the healing process as well, because sometimes talking through things can help you heal from your circumstances and trials. And with the loved ones of your parents, they are the most comfortable to like talk about your deceased loved one, because they had their own special relationship with that person longer than you had your relationship with them. Like my dad's friends knew him years before I was born, of course. So there's not that level of awkwardness or hesitation or fear of being insensitive that, like, for example, many of my friends might feel bringing up my dad, other than the ones who maybe had their own direct personal experiences with him. And also, to add to that, like, there are so many stories and memories that you hear from the loved ones of your parents that you didn't know until after they pass, and that gives you a bit of hope and reassurance, you know?
We've talked about a few things that you used to cope with your grief and your loss, and a lot of it was about turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and really leaning on your sense of tawakkul on him. I guess in that process and in that journey, were there some things that were really hard for you to part with and surrender yourself to with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
I think there are two things that stand out, two particular things that were probably hardest to surrender. The first one being the fact that, as I alluded to, it's one of the most difficult things is seeing someone you love and care for deteriorate right in front of your eyes. So, and not being able to do anything about that. So that was, I had to get to a point where I just surrendered to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that whatever He wills will happen, and I will accept that. That was very, very, very difficult and painful to see that, and that was one of the most difficult things to surrender. Another thing was when it started to become clear that my dad was probably in his last days. It was also very hard to surrender the fact that he would not see myself or my brother get married. He would not see any of his grandchildren. He has a grandchild now, alhamdulillah. My sister has a child, so he has a grandchild now. Certain, like, kind of surrendering to Allah that certain milestones that I think most children expect that their parents to witness and be a part of, surrendering that was not going to be the case. That was probably the hardest, or equally as hard as surrendering that that you have no control over, the deterioration or the health of someone. Yeah.
I feel like that's something that a lot of people will relate to. And when I hear others speak about grief, I think those are often the moments that they think about, the moments in which their loved ones aren't with them for the important kind of milestones and moments that you've said right now. I guess I'm also wondering, was there ever a sense or any moments that you had that really gave you a sense of, like, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with me here. He's guiding me through this.
Yeah, there's one story that I could tell where reflecting upon it, I felt it at the time, but reflecting upon it, like it became even clearer to me that like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was supporting me. So the timing of my father's death, he passed away on a Saturday, and he had significant deterioration the few days before. So a few days before my dad passed away, whether it was 2-3 days, something like that, I had a small group chat with some of my friends and some close friends, and I just put in a message along the lines of like my father's like really unwell. The next couple of days are critical. Keep him in your du'as, etc. And one of my closest friends was in that group, and he saw the message, and it just so happened to be that Saturday was when he was coming back from outside of Melbourne, because he was still in uni and studying outside of Melbourne. And the day before, on the Friday, he messaged me and he said like, "Salam bro, can I come and like visit you and see you and things?" And I said, "I'm not feeling like that right now. I'll let you know tomorrow how I feel." Just because I was more focused on the family at that time, because the doctor on the Friday told us that like, yeah, something could happen as soon as 48 hours. So obviously I wanted to prioritize family. So I went through the next day, and we all had the chance to visit my dad that day. So my mum visited him in the morning, and myself and my siblings and my brother-in-law, we visited him in the afternoon. And we were the last people to see him. So we left the hospital, and on the way home, my close friend that I told you about, he lives like off one of the main roads on my way home. So it's like it's on the way home. It's not a detour for me. So as we were driving home, my brother was driving. I told him, I just had a feeling that came into my heart. I told him, "Let's pull over into like such and such a street. I'm gonna see if he's home and just talk to him." I just felt like I don't know. It was like I felt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pushing me to speak to this friend of mine. So I called him. I said, "Bro, are you home? I'm in your street." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, I'm gonna be in front in like a minute." So he came out. I spoke to him, and I basically gave him an update that, yeah, we just came from the hospital. We saw Dad. He's not doing well. Something could happen any day now. We took it as potentially the last time we'll ever see him. And yeah, like we're prepared for anything to happen. And then as I was giving him the update, I got a call from a private number. And at that time I was answering all phone calls, like private numbers or unrecognized numbers, just in case there was an emergency related to my dad's situation. And I put the phone on speaker because my phone was like damaged, so the speaker wasn't too loud, so I couldn't put it to my ear. So I put it on speaker with my friend standing next to me, and then the nurse, it was the head nurse of the ward, saying, "Ameen, this is Alison, nurse in charge, just informing you that your father has passed away." And my friend heard that right in front of me. So what happened was, obviously I went into like a mode where I needed to just make sure my family was all good, my mum was good, that we start taking care of my dad's affairs and things. So my friend, I was like, "All right, I'm gonna go home now with my brother." And my friend insisted, like, "Let me follow you." So he quickly went in the house and got ready. Came down to my house like 15 minutes after I had gotten home, after I had, seen my mum, after I had told my sister and told them to come to our house, so we're all in one place. My friend, he came to my house. He was with me the whole time. He also called one of our other close friends to come down, and those two brothers were. So I went to the hospital 3 times that day. One was to visit my father in the afternoon. Then the next one was to come and pack up his belongings and take them home while he was still in the hospital bed. So I actually saw him. Then the third time was we managed to get in touch with the mosque that night and like start the proceedings. So going with the mosque undertaker to go and pick up my dad's body and bring it to the mosque. Those two brothers of mine were with me that whole time. And I really felt that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala supported me in that, because I don't think I would have reached out. I would have felt, and I do feel confident that I would have been able to like do all that by myself, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And yeah, like I said, if I didn't reach out, then that support wouldn't have been there. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made things unravel in a way where the support was there that I probably wouldn't have asked for. But was of a great help for me, and that I'm very grateful for. So yeah, that's one way I feel that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just was really supporting me. And also the fact that literally my friend came down for less than a week. He came, the day he came was the day my dad died. He came to Melbourne a few hours earlier, and then he left on like the Thursday back to where he was staying after like the 3 days of my, like the condolences that we were accepting from the community. It was almost like Allah timed it perfectly. It could have been a week earlier, a week later, but Allah timed it perfectly.
Yeah, subhanAllah. It's such a beautiful story that, you know, only touches, it's like a drop in the ocean of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward that friend. Like,
and keep us all close to people who are like that and who are able to be there for us in times of need, right? I think it says so much about the people. I think it says so much about you that you have such like beautiful people around you as well, who are willing to kind of get straight into there and get into the deep end of things, even when things become hard, right? So subhanAllah, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep us all protected and close to people like that.
Ameen. It's the nature of Islamic friendships as well, like that suhbah between us and our friends is, it's so much deeper than the word friendship can encompass. You know, and that's why it's really beautiful that we refer to them as brothers, because in so many ways that they are brothers, they are sisters, and yeah, it's another blessing of the many that Allah has bestowed upon us.
SubhanAllah, they wouldn't even like, they would refuse to like even let me drive or anything, you know, like they really were there to support me. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them and bless them.
Ameen. You know, I wanted to touch on one point that you mentioned. You talked about when you received that call, you kind of immediately went into action mode, right? And as is, you know, I guess the responsibility of the eldest child and also someone who seems to have been taking care of his family until that point regardless. I'm wondering where and what the point was where you kind of had the opportunity to sit down and take it in and really process the reality of what's just happened and I guess the loss that you had just experienced.
I think part of it is, as I mentioned earlier, that I feel like I got to a level of acceptance a couple of days before my father passed away, and at that point, my focus was just making sure that things were as comfortable for him as possible, and that his affairs were taken care of. That it was like in a manner that I was trusted with, that I would tie off his like worldly affairs. So I feel like I had already accepted and processed it to an extent, but I probably didn't get a chance to sit back and reflect and maybe decompress until probably the Thursday or the Wednesday night after he passed. So he passed away on a Saturday. We buried him on a Monday, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday night we were accepting condolences from the community. And then the Thursday was probably the first night that I got at her, like I was able to be by myself. And yeah, that's probably where it kind of sinks in. Yeah, I'd say that's where it sunk in, where like it's hard to explain, but sometimes like when you have a loved one in your life, even if they're like unwell or very sick or like much deteriorated, it still feels like just their presence being there is a calming force. Like just knowing that such and such is in like the other room down the corridor or whatever, it's like a calming force. That was probably that's when it sunk in that was probably like I'll never experience that again, because I think there's a very unique feeling that a father brings in terms of like comfortability and a sense of like calm.
Yeah.
So probably the Thursday.
Yeah, I guess, you're kind of describing the lack of presence and the fact that you had to kind of come to terms with that at a certain point. SubhanAllah. And do you have something to say?
I think our relationship with our fathers as well, what's really sort of special about, one of the many things that are special about fathers is the, with all the uncertainties of life, you can always feel like with dad around, you can always feel like you can lean on that person. Like everything will eventually be okay because you look to their strength, you look to their example, especially as a young man. And so their absence is felt in a way where you become so much more scared of the world, I think, perhaps. But
for people who might be listening to this who haven't experienced grief and, maybe seeing someone close to them go through a sense of loss and a loss, what would you tell them or what advice would you give them to help that friend or acquaintance?
I think it's important to understand that people grieve differently. Some may take it harder than others. The intensity, the most intense part of it might extend for longer periods of time for others. And also understand that just because you prefer to grieve in a certain way doesn't mean that everyone prefers to grieve in that way. So, for example, some people prefer to grieve to have a lot of people around them.
Yeah.
Other people prefer to have just maybe one or two of their closest friends and family with them. Other people, they prefer to be alone. So I think just try and gain an understanding of the way that your loved one or the person you know copes.
Yeah.
And don't put too much on them. Some other pieces of advice I give to whether it's someone you know well or just someone in the community that you know is going through grief is a lot of the time the community tends to rally around families or a family for like 3 days to a week, and then there's not much after that. Like, make sure to still be there for that person who's grieving, because grief, it lasts more than a week, it lasts more than 3 days.
it's not something that's temporary.
It's not something that's temporary. Also, a lot of people tend to say, or I heard from some that they were hesitant to like reach out because they didn't want to bother or didn't want to seem insensitive. But I think there's nothing wrong with just signaling and reaching out to show that you're actually thinking of the person. So whether it's just a text message saying, "Salam, bro, I'm thinking of you, I'm making dua for you, let me know if you need anything," or sending like a gift or a letter or a card or something, or even trying to make a phone call and being completely fine with the person not responding. I think it's important that you make that out effort and that gesture, and let the grieving person manage it how they want to. Some of them might accept your gesture. Some of them might still want to keep their distance, especially those who want to grieve alone. So I think it's really, really important to show people that you're there for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the advice I give to to people.
I love that.
supporting
And I
people.
feel like I reflect on myself a little bit. I'm like, the only times I've regretted moments like this is when I haven't reached out to someone I knew I should have, right? Because at the end of the day, what's the worst that could happen? They don't respond to you. Okay, that's fine, right?
Yeah.
But what on the other side that means is that they know that you're there, regardless
Exactly.
of, whether you reply or whether you don't reply, right? So, I think, I have to remind myself of the regret that I feel when I don't reach out,
And there's 2 points I'll add to that as well. That by you actually making a gesture, it cuts off the door for shaitan to plant a wedge between people where
So true.
like shaitan can get into someone's head that such and such didn't reach out to me, or why did like this person not reach out, this, that. And like as a grieving person, you really notice and remember those who did make the effort. Like there was one brother who I probably met like less than 5 times, and all we had was like superficial conversations like salams, this, that, how you going, prior to my dad's passing. But he, throughout, like he was touching base with me every few weeks or like every couple of months for like a whole year.
Wow.
Like just checking up on me, calling, messaging. Like sometimes it's the people you don't expect, subhanAllah. But like I'll remember him for the rest of my life, and I'll always be grateful to him. And hopefully, if he ever goes through any difficulty, hopefully I can act in a way to him that he acted towards me. So
Inshallah.
it's definitely noticed and appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as well the checking up for an extended period of time, and not because I think there would be a flood of food, a flood of support first few days, and then afterwards there might not be much contact, and potentially that's when it's the hardest to work through.
And one last thing I would add is, and this is, you have to proceed with a bit more caution with this one, but this is more so if you're very close with the person grieving. But if you sense that they're like getting down too deep into a hole or something, sometimes it's good to like try and pull them out of that. Like make them come to a social gathering, make them go out to lunch. Like
absolutely, yeah. Alhamdulillah for our community and for our suhbah and the love we have for each other.
So one other point actually that comes to our mind in terms of supporting those who are grieving is tied to what I mentioned earlier in the podcast about anticipatory grief, which I mentioned that in some cases it can actually be more emotionally challenging and exhausting than like the loss, because at least there's like a level of certainty and closure. If you know anyone who is going through a situation where they're likely to have that anticipatory grief because they have a sick family member, or maybe they might be sick themselves and not coping well, a lot of these things still also apply, like reaching out, keeping in touch with them, not letting them get too down on themselves. So it's not just about supporting someone who's lost someone, it's also supporting those who are going through any difficulty, whether it's related to a loved one or anything else.
And what advice would you give to someone who has lost someone recently?
As much as you may not like to hear it, because it can be a tough pill to swallow, but one of the most important advices is to be patient, to remain patient, to have trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You shouldn't feel any guilt for being in grief, for experiencing sadness. It's part of being a human, as we've even seen in the example of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And related to the Prophet ﷺ, I'd recommend that you dive deep into his seerah, learn from him. Everyone has a story that can relate to the Prophet ﷺ. He lost a spouse, he lost his parents, his grandparents, his uncle. all children except one died before him. He lost so many close companions. So I think everyone has a way they can relate to the Prophet ﷺ. Understand that grief is something that will always be there. You only move forward with it, and that's where your strength lies, that you move forward despite your pain and your difficulty. It's not something you just, one day you wake up and grief's like left on the side of the bed and you just walk away from it. It's going to always be there, and it comes up at certain times. Turn to Allah. If you need support from people, that's also fine, but be selective in who you seek support from. Make sure the person you're seeking support from is wise, mature, grounded in Islamic values. Otherwise, that can do more harm than good. And if you do seek support through people or any means, do always remember that support and aid comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he just uses different means for different people in different circumstances.
Very true.
Yeah.
I think there was one more that I wanted to mention.
Take your time.
Yes. And finally, understand that as hard as it is, and the grief of losing a loved one, for most people is probably one of the most, if not the most difficult experience a person will go through in life. Understand that, yes, it's very painful. Yes, it's very difficult. But it's up to you. It's within your control whether it is a blessing that brings you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or a calamity that distances you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you have no control over what happens to you, but you have control over how you respond to it and the lens that you view it from.
Yeah.
So take it as an opportunity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you to get closer to Him.
For sure. I'm remembering the blue and the red lenses
Absolutely.
example you gave, for sure.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah. And I hope that, those who are listening can take comfort in, Ameen's own experience with loss, and also some of the advice that he's just given as well, inshallah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for all of us to go through life and, suffer.
Allahumma ameen ya Rabb. And mashallah, with an example like Ameen, like I was discussing with a mutual friend that I had this episode coming up, and I was very excited for it, and I was telling him, it's with Ameen, and he goes to me, I have never seen a person live by the seerah as much as I have seen Ameen live by the seerah, mashallah. So that's a really big claim. It's a really big compliment, and it's sometimes very difficult to see that as the standard of what we should be doing or what we should be striving for. But I think the beauty there is that it was never, mashallah, and Ameen's character and the way that he is and the way that he dealt with stuff was never the end goal that he worked towards. It was through coming to know and coming to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and through understanding the deen that his iman led him there. And I think what I've extrapolated from Ameen's story and from the beautiful seerah, one of the many things that alhamdulillah I've extrapolated, is that the end goal is very difficult to work towards, but what is manageable, what we can work towards, is the coming to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala better, coming to understand the deen better, coming to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and coming to find peace in His mercy and His many attributes and names that eventually leads us to bi'idhnillah, following in the footsteps of Ameen and ultimately the Prophet bi'idhnillah. But on that note, thank you very much, Ameen, for everything that you've shared with us. I feel incredibly blessed and very grateful that you've taken your time and opened up about and had the discussion on something incredibly difficult. And I would like to ask everyone in the studio and everyone at home, or maybe if you're driving, when you park up, to join us in reciting Al-Fatiha for Ameen's father and his grandparents, inshallah.
Thank you for being with us today. If anything in this episode felt heavy or difficult, please reach out to someone you trust. You can also contact Kids Helpline on 1800 55 1800, which is a free counselling service available 24/7 for those aged 5 to 25 years. Or you can book an appointment with our Helping Hands team on the website 6degrees.org.au. Take care of yourself, and inshallah, we'll see you next time.